Hunter saved dying pregnant Bobcat. Year later, he heard a cry that brought him to tears. In the wild sprawl of the northern Rockies, where the wind moves through pines like whispered memories and snow buries the past in silence, 56-year-old Gavin Walton lived a life carved out of solitude. His cabin, old but sturdy, stood like a stubborn tree against the edge of the forest. He wasn't a recluse, not quite, but he didn't belong to the world of people anymore. Not since Maggie passed, not since their daughter left for a life with concrete beneath her feet and signals in the air. Out here, Gavin didn't need cell towers or streetlights. He had silence, and silence had him. He was a hunter, not for trophies, not for the thrill of it, but for the rhythm. He took what? He needed nothing more. Elk mostly, sometimes birds. The meat got stored, dried, packed away for winter. The rest he left to the forest. That morning in late November, frost clung to the tall grass like it didn't want to let go. Gavin tracked a fresh trail through the ravine behind his cabin. The prints were light, but purposeful. He knelt, touched one with gloved fingers, then rose without a sound. Bobcat. Not what he was after, but something in him shifted. He'd heard the shot half an hour earlier. Distant, sharp, echoing once before the woods swallowed it. It wasn't his. That was what caught his attention. Out here, shots didn't go unnoticed, and they sure as hell didn't go uninvestigated. The prints in the snow grew erratic, broken. Blood, a smear across bark. Then he found her. She was collapsed under the lean of a fallen spruce, half covered in pine needles, panting through clenched teeth. A bobcat, maybe 3 years old, her coat the color of fading sunlight. She was beautiful in a way the wild often is, untamed, raw and broken. Her leg had been hit high, too high to be clean. There was no grace in it, just pain and fear. But it wasn't the injury that stopped Gavin cold. It was the way she curled around herself, the way her belly moved. She was pregnant. The wind cut across the clearing like a warning. Gavin didn't move. Rifle slung across his back, one hand resting on the strap. It would have been easier to end it there. Quicker, cleaner. He'd done it before, not out of cruelty, but because mercy sometimes comes dressed in endings. But he didn't lift the rifle. He couldn't. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them. A shared understanding, pain maybe, or defiance. "You're not ready to go," he muttered under his breath. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears. He stepped closer. She didn't hiss, didn't lunge, just breathed, ragged, shallow. She was beyond fight, and he was beyond reason. He took off his jacket, thick, flannel-lined, and eased it around her, careful not to touch the wound. Then, gritting his teeth, he slid his arms beneath her frail body and lifted. She weighed less than he thought. Or maybe he was stronger than he remembered. The snow was knee-deep, the path uneven. Each step back toward the cabin burned through his thighs, but he didn't stop. She made no sound, not even when the cold bit through both of them. She just held on, and so did he. By the time they reached the porch, Gavin was soaked through, sweat cooling fast against his back. He kicked open the door, stoked the fire, and laid her gently near the hearth on a folded wool blanket. The cabin smelled of cedar, smoke, and now blood. He moved quickly, boiling water, cleaning the wound, using supplies he hadn't touched in years. She flinched once as he cleaned the gash, but she didn't lash out, not even when he stitched the torn flesh closed with trembling fingers. He whispered to her the way he used to whisper to Maggie in her last weeks, steady, soft, not for comfort, but to remind himself he was still here, still trying. He named her Ember before the night was over, not because she needed a name, but because he did. Ember, like the coals that stayed alive under the ash, fading but not gone. He didn't know if she'd make it through the night, but he knew this: if she did, it wouldn't be alone. The first night passed slowly. Ember lay motionless by the fire, her breathing shallow, her sides twitching every so often with pain or dream. Gavin didn't sleep. He sat across the room, elbows on knees, watching the rise and fall of her chest. The storm outside had started up again, snow tapping at the windows like ghostly fingers. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't even sure he was sane. But there was no turning back now. He'd made a choice. And in the stillness of that long mountain night, the silence between man and beast felt like something sacred. By morning, her breathing had steadied, not healed, not yet, but no longer spiraling downward. He fed her bits of venison warmed on the stove, set water beside her in a shallow dish. She didn't eat at first, just looked at him with those tired golden eyes. Then slowly, she nudged the meat with her nose and took it. That was the first turning point. Gavin fixed up the old storage room beside the kitchen, cleared out boxes, laid down fresh straw, blankets, anything soft. He carried Ember in, carefully, her body still fragile and stiff. She didn't resist, didn't growl. She was running on instinct now, and somehow it told her he wasn't a threat, not anymore. As the days passed, he found a rhythm, heating pads in the corners, bowls of food placed gently inside the doorway. He never got too close, never reached. To pet her, it wasn't about affection, it was about survival. Still, something between them had started to settle, not trust, not quite, but tolerance. The quiet kind, the kind forged in hard places. He'd talk to her sometimes, not long conversations, just murmurs as he passed her door. "Hold on, Ember. You're stronger than you look. Storm's easing up tonight." He didn't expect her to understand. He just needed to speak. She just needed to listen. And that was enough. Then, one night in early December, it happened. He woke to a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the creaking of the old cabin. A low growl followed by a series of short, sharp cries. Not loud, but urgent. Gavin didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lantern barefoot and moved fast through the cabin to the storage room. What he saw stopped him cold. Ember was crouched low, body arched, eyes wild but clear. Blood soaked the straw beneath her. One kitten had already been born, slick and small, blind and squirming. Another was coming. She was doing it on her own, all instinct, no help, no fear, just raw maternal will. He stood back, watched, waited. Hours passed. 3 kittens, then 4. Tiny things, barely larger than his palm, their fur matted, their eyes sealed shut. They mewled softly, pressing into her belly, searching for warmth. Ember curled her body around them, her breathing slow but steady. And Gavin, standing in the glow of a single lantern, felt something shift deep in his chest, a crack in the stone that had settled there after Maggie died. Something old and soft and almost painful. He didn't cry. Not then. But he sat outside. That room till dawn, listening to the occasional mew from within, watching the snow fall outside the window like a second silence. The next few weeks were a blur of movement, feeding Ember, keeping the fire going, cutting wood, checking the traps he'd long forgotten. He rarely went into town. He didn't tell anyone. What would he say? That a bobcat had given birth in his house? That he was raising wild things in? Secret? No. This was between him and the forest. The kittens grew fast. At first, they stayed nestled against Ember, sleeping and feeding, their tiny tails twitching with dreams. But soon they were walking. Awkward steps, curious eyes. They hissed at his shadow, tried to pounce on each other, swatted at nothing. In the air, Ember kept watch, still protective, but less wary of Gavin now. She'd glance up when he came to the door, not startled, just aware, and every night before turning in, he'd whisper the same thing at the doorway. "You weren't supposed to make it, none of you were, but here you are." By the time the snow began to melt and the first stubborn green pushed its way through the hard ground, the kittens had transformed. No longer helpless things nestled in straw, they were now sleek, fierce, and restless. 4 shadows with muscle beneath their coats and fire behind their eyes. They played rough, sharpened their claws on the walls, and leapt at invisible prey with the reckless abandon of the wild. The cabin had gone from a place of quiet solitude to a den on the edge of chaos. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to carry the sound of paws skidding across wood, something being knocked over, something being stalked. But Gavin didn't mind. Not really. He'd taken to sitting just outside the storage room some evenings, a cup of black coffee in hand, listening to their growls and screeches. Occasionally, one of the bolder kittens, the largest male with a torn ear from play fighting, would stare out at him through the half-cracked door, curious but cautious. He'd never touched them, never tried to. That was part of the quiet deal he'd made with Ember. He was here to help, not to own, not to tame. Ember, for her part, had regained most of her strength. The limp in her hind leg never fully went away. She would carry that for life. But she moved with purpose now, still protective, still wild. But something in her had softened. When Gavin entered to place food, she no longer growled or shifted. To block the kittens, she watched, that was all. Watched him the way the trees watched the wind, went without judgment, but never forgetting what they were. Then came the decision he'd been dreading. He knew the moment would come, knew that the walls were closing in, not for him, but for them. The bobcats needed space, territory, danger. They needed wind in their fur, real prey beneath their paws. They weren't meant for 4 walls and hand-fed meals, no matter how carefully measured. It was Ember who told him first, not with words, but with absence. She started spending more time near the back window, staring out into the woods. She'd pace the cabin some nights, sit by the back door, alert, ears twitching. Something was calling to her. Gavin sat on the porch one early April morning, the sun just cresting the tree line, and thought about what came next. He lit his pipe, even though he'd quit 2 winters ago, and watched the smoke curl up into the still cold air. The thought of losing them all at once, Ember, the kittens, felt like being hollowed out. Again. Like grief didn't care how many times it knocked. It just kept coming back. But he'd never tried to make them his. That was the difference. He'd saved them, yes, but the wild didn't owe him a thing. They weren't pets, they weren't possessions. They were wild souls, on loan from the land, and their time was running short. He called Teresa that afternoon, the wildlife biologist he trusted, someone who knew the difference between rehabilitation and captivity. When she picked up, he just said, "They're ready." She didn't ask questions. Said she'd bring a team in a few weeks. Get them. Tagged, transported, evaluated, released. That night the cabin felt too quiet. The kittens were still raising hell in the back room, but Gavin had already begun to feel their absence, like the echo of a voice before the silence sets in. He walked out to the enclosure he'd started building the week before. A wide pen. Near the edge of the woods with climbing logs, hiding spaces, and a wire fence high enough to hold them, but low enough to see through. It wasn't freedom, but it was a start, a bridge between what they knew and what they were meant for. With Teresa's help, they moved the bobcats outside a few days later. One by one, using thick gloves and gentle traps. Ember went last, tense, but quiet, her eyes scanning every movement. She watched as the kittens explored the enclosure, climbing, pouncing, vanishing into the underbrush Gavin had laid out. She paced the fence at first, then lay in the sun and waited. Gavin kept his distance. He fed them less now, and what he gave them was whole, live when possible, rats, rabbits, letting them feel the hunt again. He started wearing a mask when he approached, kept silent, gave them space. It went against every part of his heart, but it was the right thing. He wasn't their father. He was just the man who didn't pull the trigger. One evening, as the sun dropped below the trees and the wind picked up. He sat on the porch and watched the enclosure from a distance. One of the kittens, the same one with the torn ear, stared back at him through the mesh. No fear, just recognition. Not of a master, not even of a caretaker, just of someone who had been there. And Gavin whispered into the coming night, "I see you too, kid." The release was set for mid-May. The snow had melted completely by then. The rivers swollen and swift from runoff, the forest alive with birdsong and scent. Teresa and her team arrived just after dawn, bringing with them the gear: tranquilizer darts, tracking tags, transport, crates, and a quiet efficiency that made Gavin feel like the whole thing was happening too fast. He knew it had to happen. He'd said yes. He'd helped plan it. But when the truck rumbled up the road and the professionals stepped out, it all felt a little too final. The Bobcats were darted one by one. Ember first. She fought the sedative longer than the rest, stubborn to the end. Even with a limp and a half-healed wound, she still paced and growled until her body finally gave in. Teresa crouched next to her, checked vitals, adjusted the sedation dose with practiced hands. "She's a fighter," she said, glancing at Gavin. He just nodded. Words felt like gravel in his throat. The kittens, nearly full-grown now, were next. They moved like ghosts, low to the ground, golden eyes sharp. The crew worked fast, safe. The cats didn't go easy, but they didn't go violent either. They were ready. Maybe more than Gavin was. He stood back, hands in his coat pockets, watching. Each one be lifted into a crate, secured, tagged. One of them, the same male with the notched ear, locked eyes with him as the cage door swung shut. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, just something quiet, something final. Teresa approached when it was done. "We'll take them to the ridge, above Wildstone Creek. No human trails up there. Big territory, plenty of prey. They'll be tracked for the first few months. We'll monitor behaviors, make sure they're adapting." "And after that?" Gavin asked. She hesitated, then said what he already knew. "After that, they're on their own." The crates were loaded into the truck. The team climbed in. Doors slammed. The engine kicked to life with a deep growl. And just like that, they were gone. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was too sharp, too hollow, the kind that echoes in the ribs. The kind that comes after you hand something back to the world that you were never meant to keep. Gavin stood in the empty clearing, the enclosure now still, the straw turned, the scent of wild still clinging to the air. It felt wrong to tear it down, so he didn't. He just opened the gate and left it that way, a doorway to nowhere. The days passed slow after that. The cabin was back to being quiet, the kind of quiet he used to cherish. But now it scraped. He moved through routines, cut wood, patched a leak on the roof, tied flies for a fishing trip he never took. Sometimes he found himself standing at the edge of the enclosure without realizing he'd walked there, just staring at the empty space where life used to move. Teresa called, once a week with updates. The cats were doing well, adapting fast, hunting for themselves, sticking close to each other, which was unusual for bobcats. "They're behaving more like a small pack than solo predators," she said once. "It's rare, possibly even unique." Gavin listened but didn't say much, just wrote down the location coordinates she gave him and traced them on an old map with a pencil. They were 27 miles away now. Deep forest, no cabins, no roads, and no reason to come back. Still, some nights he left the back porch light on. He didn't tell anyone in town about the bobcats, didn't want stories spreading. They were wild now, and the wild deserved privacy. When someone asked about the worn-down enclosure behind his cabin, he just said it was an old project he never finished. No one pressed him. People in the mountains know when not to ask questions. That summer was hot and dry. Fires raged further west, but the forests near Wildstone were untouched. Teresa's updates slowed. Eventually, they stopped. "They're off-grid now," she'd said. Last pings were good. After that, it's their world. Gavin accepted it. What choice did he have? That's what letting go means. You don't just lose something, you lose the right to know how it ends. Still, he couldn't help but wonder. Did they forget him already? Did they even understand who he was in the first place? Or had it all been just survival? Instinct and need, like any other wild thing. He never expected an answer. But the forest has its own way of answering. It was late September when Gavin heard it again. At first he thought it was just the wind, the kind of wind that howls through the mountain passes, bending trees and filling the air with eerie, mournful sounds. But then it came again, sharp and high-pitched, unmistakable. The cry echoed through the clearing outside his cabin, not a scream of agony, not the sound of something in danger, but a cry of desperation, a cry that carried something Gavin hadn't heard in a year. It was the sound of a bobcat. His heart jumped in his chest. He stood frozen in the dim light of his cabin, listening, as the wind picked up, pushing the branches into a dark dance. The cry came again, and this time it was closer. Much closer. He grabbed the rifle that had been leaning against the wall, more out of instinct than reason. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew it couldn't be good. Stepping. Outside, the cold hit him immediately, sharper than it had been in weeks. The mountains were shifting, the season preparing to turn. As he moved toward the tree line, he didn't have to search for long. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, he saw them. The silhouette of a bobcat stood at the edge of the pines. Her coat was familiar but ragged, weathered by time and struggle, ember. And behind her another figure emerged from the shadows, a smaller shape, moving with the same grace. One of her kittens. Gavin's breath caught. His hand dropped from the rifle, and for a moment he just stood there, rooted to the spot. He hadn't expected this, not like this, not now. It had been months since the release, months since he'd last seen them, heard them, even thought about them. He had let them go, resigned himself to the fact that they had found their place in the wild, far from him. And yet, here they were, back. Ember was cautious, but not fearful. Her golden eyes locked with his across the darkened yard. There was no aggression in her stance, just a quiet recognition, as if she was waiting for him to acknowledge what had happened. She moved slowly, the smaller kitten following in her wake. For a long moment, Gavin didn't speak. His eyes went from Ember to the kitten and back. He wanted to reach out, to call them back inside, to shelter them again like he had done so many months before. But he knew better. This was their world now, and he wasn't part of it. But then the kitten, the one with the torn ear, the one who had always been bolder, stepped forward. He hesitated just a few feet from Gavin, then let out a small, plaintive cry. It was the same cry Gavin had heard earlier, the same sound that had driven him from his cabin and into the night. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't fear. It was something else, something that he couldn't explain, something that pulled at him in a way he didn't expect. Rusty. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know why he said the name, maybe because it was the one thing he could hold on to, the one thing that connected them. Rusty didn't move closer. He just watched Gavin, eyes wide in the way. Only wild things can be, calculating, cautious, but undeniably familiar. The same golden eyes that had watched him from behind the enclosure, the same pair that had once turned to him for food, for safety. And in that moment, Gavin understood. Something he hadn't before. He hadn't just been their caretaker. He had been part of their story, part of their survival. The wild didn't just take what it needed and forget. It remembered. It remembered the hands that had saved them, the care that had kept them alive. When there had been no one else, Ember stepped forward now, her head low. She sniffed the air and then, without warning, nudged Rusty forward. The kitten took another hesitant step, then paused again, looking up at Gavin. His golden eyes shimmered in the moonlight. "You made it," Gavin whispered, as if the words could fill the space between them. "You're still here." Ember turned and led Rusty back toward the woods, her tail flicking behind her. For a moment she stopped and looked back at Gavin, as if to say goodbye, as if to thank him for what he had done. Then they disappeared into the trees. Gavin stood there long after they were gone, the night swallowing their silhouettes. His heart was heavy, but not with sadness. It was full of something deeper than grief or loss. It was the quiet, knowing that he had done the right thing, that he had given them weight fat they needed, even if it meant letting them go. And in return, they had remembered. The cry in the pines didn't come again. But sometimes, when the wind was still, when the moon hung low in the sky, Gavin would hear a rustle in the trees just outside the cabin. It was fleeting, like a whisper, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that the wild was never far from home. And maybe, just maybe, that the bond between them wasn't as broken as it seemed. He would sit on the porch in the quiet, feeling the cool night air on his skin. The mountains stretched before him, vast and unyielding. And yet, he didn't feel alone, not anymore, because sometimes the wild remembers you, and sometimes you remember it right back.